Most ballads and epics of all Talaron's most well-known heroes, adventurers, and other such legendary figures begin somewhere after they've accepted the quest, or begun to work as adventurers or other such violently minded careers. Most bards and scribes don't like to talk about the early days of such figures, as they are almost always so much less impressive than their later work. Granathor the Bold is known for his quest to cleanse Grey Mountain of the Trogs, and not for his decade and a half working in a stable shoveling vast quantities of horse shit. Yet it is his time working in a stable that gave him the endurance he'd need for his quest. Similarly, Narila the Nimble is known for her impressive and daring heists, and not the quilts and blankets she made for a living before her heists were all that successful. One might think that mages are immune to this, considering their time spent training to become a mage or wizard involves throwing fireballs at one another. However, bards skip over this time in a mage's life as well, because bards rarely want to talk about people like Calethorn the Gaunt having to do homework, or Qualisra being constantly late for class. Even those who can cast magic are not above mundane tasks or boring days. Then there are the many mages who graduate and never cast magic in anger in their life. Academics who never feel the need to wander the lands, seeking danger and possibly horrible death. While now it is very hard to imagine the infamous Spellslinger as one who'd seek out this sort of life, he actually thought that would be his future. He had a fascination with the side of magic that was more suitable to controlled testing and study than wild use in the field. He had every intention of graduating, and then spending his days tending to his garden of rare and violent plants while expanding upon the study of magic itself. How it worked, why it worked, how it could be made more accessible to all, and not just controlled by the few, even if he was one of those few. But this was not to be, or at least not for a while. For there is this terrible moment in any student's life, magic or otherwise, where they must graduate and come to grips with the terrifying realm that is called reality, where hopes and expectations get broken upon the rocky shores of job markets and finances. Of course, this would all lead to the formation of one of the most infamous adventuring groups of all time, but it is not well known by most scholars or even bards what brought this group together. Most pick up their tale later on with their more popular and well-known quests. This is not because their first task was mundane, quite the opposite. This is more to deal with the desire of those involved to keep it quiet. This is a story about how Steve Spellslinger gets a job. Graduation day! I'm so excited! Steve grinned as he looked over his toga fresh from the capital of his home country, the Almarin Republic. Not only had he been given a pure white toga, but it had thin purple stripes, the very first of its kind. Togas meant different things to the Almarins, and so a white toga itself was for important people. But with purple stripes along the edges, that was new. No one had purple yet. First of his kind. Mage! He was quite excited as he looked at his somewhat distorted reflection in his mirror. Glass mirrors had just started to become a thing recently, and he preferred them to the magic mirrors. Less snarky sass talk. Who'd have ever thought my retarded brother would one day graduate from an academy of any kind? Steve glared at his brother Chris, who'd come to the ceremony with his kids. I guess this almost makes up for not being able to have sex for 2.5 decades. Steve snorted at that. I wouldn't say that. Oh, what did they teach you, how to conjure up some sheep to keep you warm? Steve then cast his glare over at his brother Mark. Hey now, I'm not the one spending all day in the field with the herds. Steve replied and was about to continue when there was a knock at the door, immediately followed by his sister Carla opening the door and sticking her head in. You shitheads done comparing your dicks yet? Or do you need to find a magnifying glass? The three brothers shot back their own battery of insults before she waved them off and continued. Mom's all ready, and that snooty elf kid said the ceremony will begin soon, so we should get out to the main audience chamber. All right, you guys should go then. I need to go find my girlfriend. She should be here soon. Steve mentioned, before Mark gently reached out to caress Steve's right hand. Oh, hello! It's so nice to meet Steve's girlfriend after all these years. He spoke to Steve's hand as Steve jerked it back then out of his brother's grip. fucking bite me." Steve growled back as his brothers laughed, and then finally headed out the door, leaving him to look over his robe once more, making sure it was hanging properly before nodding. He headed out of his room into the hall outside where he could see his mother and siblings herding his dozen or so nieces and nephews towards the main audience chamber. He'd grinned when the Archdean had complained that he was testing their policy on not limiting how many people one could invite to their graduation. Really, he knew it was only a matter of time before they clamped down on it. Humans just had way more family than elves or dwarves. However, he needed to make sure his final guest would make it. He quickly made his way out of the male dorms and down to the grand entrance hall. There were plenty of dignitaries from many of the most respected nations of Talaron here today, but not one from Almera. Politics. He kept moving, however, since this was far too busy for him to want Sherry wandering through and causing a fuss. So he kept moving until he was near the garden gate next to the library. It was fairly quiet most of the time, and there was just a bored elf student sentinel sitting near the gate, reading up on potions and poisons, what to eat and what not to eat. Steve was very familiar with the book. His own suggestion to add on a compendium on things to eat only if you want to trip was denied, of course, but he still had plans to get it added one day. As he stepped outside, he smiled at the clear blue sky. It was a gorgeous day. Now he just needed to wait for Sherry to port in. He'd given her the coordinate scroll already. He wished there were some way to track the passage of time more accurately so that they could show up at the same time. "Who's your potions, Professor?" he asked the student sentinel, then figuring he'd pass the time chatting with the other student. "Oh, Professor Kalrana." The elf looked up from her book then, obviously a bit surprised at the interruption of her studies. "On the multiple choice part, expect her to throw in a bunch of answers on the same letter in a row. She does that to mess with your head. But it's fine if it's like 4 or 5 in a row of the same letter." When he mentioned that, the elf perked up a bit. "Really? I knew it. I kept getting messed up on the ambush quizzes that were all the same letter answer. It's really confusing." Steve nodded as he leaned against the gate then. "Yeah, she plays head games with her tests. How many more years do you have here?" "2, I'm almost out." "You're one of the humans, right?" she asked, and he just arched a brow as she laughed nervously. "Right. There are only 3 of you, so that sort of answers that question. Are you the one that all the teachers hate?" Now Steve just grinned. "Oh yeah, that's me." He really was establishing a true legacy for himself here, it seemed. "So did you really break the senior-level spell golem? They said that's never happened before. What sort of spells did you cast at it?" He laughed and shook his head. "Dispel and counterspell, that's it." He could see her confused look, so he went on. "The golem is designed to get stronger and adapt to what spells you hit it with to make you have to adapt back. Well, all I would do is dispel and counterspell which it can't build off or absorb and smashed it to bits with a hammer. They've hired a team of dwarves and even a few goblins to build one that's immune to humans. All I know is if they don't let me help them design it, I'm going to go break it a few more times until they get it right." "Aren't you afraid they'll finally kick you out?" she asked then, and he shrugged. "They haven't managed it yet." He was going to go on when he heard the short pop of a displacement bubble as he leaned back and saw Sherry standing in the garden now. "Hey, hun!" He stepped back and waved her over. She smiled as she approached, wearing a very nice purple dress, which matched the purple of his toga stripes. When she stepped through the gate, though, the elf squeaked in surprise and tossed her book at the half-demon who narrowly avoided getting hit in the head with the book. "Whoa! What the fuck?" Steve blurted out. "Demon! Summon the sentinels!" The student, as she picked up the stool she'd been sitting on and waved it in front of her as if to ward off Sherry, who was just leaning back, hands raised, trying not to look threatening. "Whoa, whoa, whoa!" Steve gasped out as he held his hands out. "Calm down! She's my girlfriend. She's here to attend the graduation. Look, the arcane constructs aren't even activating." He waved his hand at the constructs on either side of the gate who hadn't activated. The student blinked at that, slowly lowering her stool. "But she's a demon." She looked from Steve to Sherry and back a few times. "Half demon," Sherry corrected, finally speaking. and I promise I'm not here to do any harm. Otherwise I'd have been smote by the wards. Smote? Is that right? She asked, and Steve shrugged. But what if it's a trick? I mean, I was thinking hostile stuff, right? Why didn't the constructs activate? She asked, looking up at the nearest one. Probably because you were just thinking you were defending yourself? Steve asked, and then cleared his throat. Here, let me check. I will fucking kill you! He shouted suddenly, and growled at the elf, who squealed and raised her stool back up. The nearest construct began to rise up then. Warning, hostile action detected. But then Steve just stayed still and stretched a little. The construct waited for a few more seconds before closing back up. They still work, Steve said as the student slowly lowered her stool. I guess they do. You're dating a demon, though, really? She asked. Half demon? Sherry corrected once more. Isn't that all kinds of taboo for both of you? She asked. First of all, when you tell a human not to do something, that just makes them want to do it more. Secondly, you're what, 123? The elf looked surprised and nodded. Yeah, how did you know? Most humans or most non-elves have no idea how old we are. Steve just shrugged. It's just a trick I picked up when I learned what the elven age of He coughed as both Sherry and the elf gave him a look. I can. Anyway, what I was going to say is you're young for an elf, but I'm pretty old for a human. I mean, I'm 40 and most of my siblings' eldest children are in their early 20s. Now Sherry looked surprised. You're 40? She asked, and he glanced over at her, arching a brow. Yeah? Well, not yet. In a few weeks. My birthday is later this month. Besides, this level of mage training takes 25 years. Me and the other first human tryouts were recruited at 15. Did you not know that? She just stared at him as they both looked confused. But the way you act, the way you look. Sherry waved at him a little and he nodded as he suddenly understood. I look like I'm in my 20s. Sure, it's all the magic. Elves live about 1,000 years naturally, but dwarf mages have their lifespans extended by centuries. Since all 3 human mages are currently the same age, I have no idea how long our lives will be extended, but you can bet it's more than double. He shrugged then. Besides, you're 37, yeah? We're not far off in age. Or did you like to think you'd bagged yourself a young stud? He grinned and wiggled his eyebrows before Sherry just rolled her eyes. Okay then I guess. Enjoy the graduation ceremony, the elf said a bit sheepishly. Sorry for trying to hit you with my book. It's okay. You've got good reflexes. Sherry assured the student and picked up the book before handing it over. With that, Steve took Sherry's hand then so he could start leading her back through the academy. So this is the infamous Orbitus? Sure is. I'll have to show you around properly later, but for now, we need to get you to the audience hall. I'll introduce you to my family real quick, and then I need to go take my place for the ceremony. I wish I had a bit more time to hang around a bit longer, but I'm sure you'll all get along just fine. By the way, have you managed to find me someone the crap have betrayed yet? He asked, glancing over at her. I've got a few leads. The issue isn't so much finding people they've killed, but people they've killed who can help. And also aren't evil. They do seem to, have more collateral damage than most so-called do-gooders, but they do in fact try and target evil people. Mostly. Steve shrugged as she told him that. I think overzealous people like that can be just as dangerous, if not more so, than evil ones. As he brought her to the grand audience chamber, they could see the 100 or so relatives of the graduating mages arranged in seats before the main stage. They were well-dressed and mostly from wealthy and powerful elven or dwarven families. They were the height of Talaron society. And then, behind them, were Steve's family, who were clearly the largest group of people there for one mage, taking up 24 seats. Steve was about to lead her past the door when the sentinels on either side readied their staffs. "Halt, demon!" one shouted as they drew close. "She's my girlfriend and she's invited! Fuck off!" Steve hissed out and kept walking as they sentinels paused at that and watched them walk inside. After a few moments of nothing else happening, they looked to one another before one shrugged and they resumed their posts. Steve, meanwhile, was leading Sherry up to the cluster of his family at the back of the hall. Sherry, I'd like you to meet Helen, my mother. So this is the girl you've told me about? Oh, she's so lovely. His mother smiled then, and Sherry extended her hand to shake, but his mother just stepped up and pulled her in for a big hug. Oh, it's so wonderful to meet you. Steve has written so many wonderful things about you. Sherry let out a soft gasp as Steve's mother partially crushed her in the hug before finally letting go. The half-demon smiled then and tried to fix her hair up quickly. Ah, yes, he's a wonderful man, you raised him right, she replied, which made Helen blush, and part pat, part slap Sherry on the shoulder, making her stagger a little. Oh, you're just too kind. Now, let me introduce my siblings. Steve went on. This is Mark, Chris, Carla, Lana, and Nancy. Then these are their spouses, Marissa, Kelsey, Jane, Paul, and Luke. I won't introduce all their kids because we'll be here too long. Sherry shook the hand of each of his brothers and sisters, and in turn their spouses. I think he means because he's forgotten all our names. A boy in his early teens mentioned wearing a Almarin tunic. What's that, little Billy? You want your Uncle Steve to hit you with a lightning bolt to teach you some manners? Steve growled out at his nephew. My name isn't Billy. That's too bad, little Timmy. Steve then quickly shuffled his feet back and forth on the rug that ran up the center of the audience room. The others stopped and watched as he shuffled his feet back and forth rapidly before he reached out and touched his nephew's arm, to which they could hear a little zap. Ow! The kid said as he rubbed his arm, and Steve just stuck his tongue out at him. Now stop lipping off to your big powerful uncle who is in fact a mage and can control the elements themselves. He struck a pose with his hands outstretched before letting out a maniacal laugh. Then he looked up at the platform and saw the Archon pointing at him. Whoops! Gotta go! Have fun talking! No one start a fight! I'll be back! With that, he raced up the hall to get onto the stage and scurry off to the side to take his place with the other graduates. He couldn't help but smile when he saw the glares from most of his teachers and the Arch Council. Except Archchair Tyrinia. She was too good-natured and forgetful to hate anyone. Oh, and Duskmaw. Steve still wanted to find out what she was. Once he was off in the line of other students getting ready to graduate, he still had to wait for things to begin. Steve, glad to hear you actually passed everything, though I was a little surprised. Steve reached out to give Kirsten a forearm grab as he smiled at the second human mage. Yeah, I have a tendency to surprise people. He agreed, and then smiled and waved at Riava, who was wearing the robe and circlet of the valedictorian. Hey, Riava, you excited to be the first human mage ever? I hope you've got some big spell planned to show off. The woman snorted as he mentioned Than, running a hand through her long gold locks. She was actually a brunette, but she magically colored her hair because she thought it made her look more elven. Don't be silly. Graduation isn't about showing off. It's simply about being acknowledged for one's hard work. If it isn't about showing off, how come we have a big ceremony where we invite dignitaries from all over the world? Steve asked, and watched the woman scowl for a moment. Shut up, was her simple reply as he cackled and then slapped Kirsten's shoulder. Come on, man, aren't you excited at least? He asked the stocky human. Oh, I am. The other human grinned back, showing a bit more emotion than Riava. I've been asked by the Grand Chancellor of the Francomania Alliance to become the first court mage. Steve nodded and gave the other human another pat on the shoulder. Hey, that's good stuff. Those city-states need all the help they can get against those Kasurian assholes. How about you, Riava? You get any job offers yet? He asked then, as she glared back at him for a moment. My father is of course going to welcome me back as his sole heir, just as it should be. Steve nodded at that, remembering she was a crown princess of the Varenzi, which really did explain so much about her. But I've accepted an offer from the Halurian Kingdom to study at their Grand Library for a number of years. Steve wasn't surprised by her invitation by the elves. She'd probably make her ears pointy if she could. What about you, Steve? You get some offers from, He blinked as he looked at Steve for a while until Steve spoke up. Almera? He offered, and then Kirsten nodded. No, but I didn't ask anyone. The Senate gave me this nice new toga in honor of my achievement, but they are undecided about mages in government. Besides, I figure I'll stay here and study magic. That's what I'm most interested in anyway." He noticed Riava stick her nose in the air for a moment. "I assume you simply did something to make your king hate you, or he'd have offered you a position anyway." "Ah, we don't have kings," Steve started to explain. "Emperor, then, or queen, I suppose." She shrugged dismissively. "We've got consuls. They're elected officials, for 1 year." Steve explained then, which made the woman give him a strange look. "How could you possibly get anything done with a ruler who is only in power for a single year?" she asked. "Ah, well, there are 2 at a time, so twice as much gets done." Steve knew he should leave it at that, but he couldn't. "And it works for us just fine. 200 years ago, there was little more than Almera. 100 years ago, we didn't even have a navy. Now, we've absorbed every major local human settlement and even integrated some of the local orc tribes. Not to mention, we kicked the crap out of those stupid Darginians and rule their old territory. Now it's just us, and mostly the incredibly old elf kingdoms left over on Narmetia." "Ooh, yes, I forgot you're from that dreadfully uncivilized continent." Steve glared at the woman, who glared back until Karistan coughed and slapped Steve on the back. "But hey, I bet you're looking forward to the party once this is over. Boy, did you sure bring a lot of family." The other mage tried to change the subject. "Just my mom, my brothers and sisters and their kids," Steve said with a shrug. "We're plebs. Plebs have lots of kids." Then he paused and rubbed his chin. "Wait, are we still plebs? I have a toga now. A white toga." He trailed off as he looked over his toga before he heard the Archon's voice from the stage as she began to start off the ceremony. With that, they got quiet and waited for their turn to be called up. Overall, it was a fairly simple ceremony. Each mage was called up, and they'd walk across the stage to the Arch Council and receive their scroll of completion, and then stand on the far side. The students were called by order of their last name, except for Steve, Karistan, and Riava, who were at the very back since they were the first humans ever to graduate. The audience was told to hold their applause for the end, and in general it was a fairly quiet affair so that the Archcaster could more easily be heard to call out their name and any special achievements of theirs. Steve had broken more records than any student in the history of Arbitus, but he had a feeling Evelinus would somehow forget. It didn't take too long to get through the other students, since each class only totaled 50 students at a time. Steve was still pretty excited when Riava was called. "Next, we have the very first human graduate of the academy here," Evelinus called out. "Valedictorian of her entire class. First human invited to the Hellurian Grand Library and first student to discover a new spell in over 3 centuries. Riava Tagliano." Steve rolled his eyes at that. Sure, she was the first, but he had since made up about 100 new spells, while she just had the one. Sure, it was a good one, but... He just shrugged it off as Riava crossed the stage and took her scroll with a smile. Karistan was up next. "Now we have our second human mage, first to pioneer a new golem construction method in 4 centuries and record holder for the Gauntlet of Endurance." While Steve had nothing on Karistan's golem work technically, he should be the record holder for the Gauntlet. Only, he broke it so the council said his run didn't count. But Karistan had admitted to Steve that Steve deserved the record, and so long as Karistan admitted it, Steve didn't mind. "Karistan Heinrich von Muncher." Steve watched the other human cross the stage to get his scroll and wave to his family out in the audience somewhere. All right. Now it was Steve's turn. He rubbed his hands together with a grin. "And last." Steve noticed the way Evelinus said that and looked his way, but he just grinned back at the elf. "The third human mage, Steve." In the back, his family stood up, ignoring the rules to start clapping and cheering as he ran out across the stage, waving as he went. When he got to the Archdean, he took his scroll and held it up in the air before letting it fall back down. But as it fell, he grabbed another scroll from the sleeves of his toga, swapping them before tossing the new scroll as high as he could into the air. "Zap, zap!" he shouted as little bolts of lightning shot from his 2 pointer fingers to hit the scroll, which ignited it. The scroll exploded then in flashes of red, gold, and blue above the surprised audience. but his family just cheered and clapped harder and louder while Steve stood before the Archdean, hands raised. And that's that, folks. The party is in the reception hall. Let's hear it for all these amazing mages. 25 years in the making. Are you all ready to party? He pointed to the other students. They stood there for a moment in silence before Cariston cheered out, and then the others finally gave way and cheered as well, going along with his interruption of the normal ceremony. Enjoy the food and drinks, assembled by our finest chefs, including myself, he called out to the crowd then, and noticed Arch-Sorcerer Duskmaw shove Evelinus out of the way as she headed up the hall to get to the reception first. No matter how often he cooked for her, she just never seemed to get enough. Even though most of the council was glaring at him for ending the ceremony his way rather than theirs, he noticed that the Archdean just smiled at him. To be honest, seeing the Archon of Magic smile at him unnerved him more than the glares, so he just laughed it off nervously and hopped down from the stage to go meet up with his family and Sherry and get to the party. So she said that's not my cauldron, and I said that's okay, that's not my staff. Steve and his siblings laughed as he finished his joke, and Sherry just rolled her eyes. But he noticed her turn away to try and hide a smile as well, so he considered it a success. So far the party had gone well. People had loved his hell-baked potatoes, and his dire crab dip was a hit as well. Unfortunately, Duskmaw had eaten all the blizzard cream he'd made up, but thankfully she'd been hit with a brain freeze so bad she had to teleport to Mount Fiery Doom to try and warm up. Steve. He turned then and jumped a bit as he saw the Archdean standing there. For a glowing being of magic, the Archon could sometimes hide her presence very well. Hello, Archdean, this is... He was about to introduce everyone, but the Archon cut him off. Your family and your girlfriend, a half-demon. You didn't think I'd let her through the wards without knowing who she was, did you? She asked, and Steve blinked, because honestly, he thought that's exactly what had happened. Though I believe 2 members of your family are missing. Ah, yes. My older brother George and my father. My dad couldn't make it here from the fields of Hala without a quest of vengeance or a petition of ancestral guidance, what with being dead and all. My brother George is just off with the army since it's campaign season. His siblings nodded as he mentioned that. Campaign season? The Archon asked, seeming confused. Ah, yeah. See, the best time for the military to campaign is after sowing the fields but before harvest. As he explained, the Archon just frowned. So, your people have actually worked out the best time to go to war? Or do they campaign every summer? They assemble every summer, don't always go fight people. Mostly. He shrugged. So your brother wanted to be a warrior then? The Archon asked, but Steve shook his head. The Almarin military used to just be compulsory service of the eldest males of landowning families, and while my family was? We were plebs, but we still owned our farm. But about 50 years ago, one of our generals reorganized everything into a professional system where anyone could join. Well, any citizen? Or people who want to become citizens, I guess. Anyway, my brother still joined because it's customary. And I hear he's good at it? He looked at his mom, who nodded. He became an Evocatus Primus Pilus last year. She mentioned, and it was Steve's turn to be surprised. He did? You guys never told me. He wanted to surprise you in person when you see him. I guess I spoiled the surprise. His mom blushed a little. Well, I'm sure you're proud of your family. The Archon mentioned then. A career military leader, it sounds like, and the 3rd human mage of all time. Speaking of Steve, however, may I borrow him for a moment? The Archon kept smiling, which made Steve shiver a little for some reason once more, but his mom just nodded. Oh, certainly, I'm so proud of him. First child in our family who could read and write before the age of 10, taught the rest of us. Of course, his father could read and write a little, but nothing like Steve here. She beamed proudly, as Steve nervously laughed, and then followed the Archon as she lead him away from his family. In fact, she lead him out of the reception hall entirely, and into a side chamber that looked like it was just to store extra chairs. What's this about? He asked first. Tell me, Steve, do you know what most students do when they graduate here? She asked, and he nodded. Yeah, they stay on as academics mostly. They keep studying. Some write new tomes, some help teach new students. Why? They do this if they get patrons to help pay their continued stay and study. It isn't a free service. Those who don't get patrons often adventure to make money. That you know, yes? She asked again, and he nodded, having a bad feeling he knew where this was going. On top of that, most students don't have any debt built up from their time here before graduation. It's paid for by their home nations. Did you know that Almera has opted to not pay our suggested fee? Ah, no, I did not. Steve began to feel even more nervous. Did you get any patrons willing to support your continued stay? She asked, and he just remained quiet. This is a summary of the total amount for your time here from first being brought in to graduation, and that's the first-year cost to stay on and study here. She handed him a scroll that materialized out of thin air. I'm sure we can arrange something. If I talk to the Senate, they'd probably see holy shit. He gasped as he opened the scroll and actually read it. Ha! But that's holy shit, he repeated. Yes, indeed, the Archon replied. So this was it. This was how she was going to get rid of him. His shoulders slumped then for a moment. However, I'm willing to become your patron. He looked up at her then, eyes narrowing for a moment. She hated him, didn't she? What's the catch? He asked after a few seconds. Are you familiar with the concept of plausible deniability? It's a human phrase, I'm told. I actually rather like it. He arched his brows now, wondering where this was going. I'll just assume you're familiar. Now I know you're familiar with the Helurian Grand Library, especially since they want Riava to attend. What you might not know is that I have it on very good authority that they're trying to build their own academy, using their extensive catalog of magic books and tomes as the base. This is unacceptable. They've been trying to acquire artifacts, books, and even personnel from this academy for centuries, but they've become increasingly aggressive, and I won't stand for it any longer. You said before that I'd want you around to see to any task I thought the academics couldn't handle, so this is it. I want you to burn down the Helurian Grand Library. I don't know. Won't this start a war or something? He muttered, feeling a little overwhelmed. Students go rogue, you know. Not to mention I have no need of you to reveal your identity while you do this. If you're worried about Riava, she won't be attending once she realizes her people need her at home more than she needs to study further. Do this, Steve, and your debt will be forgiven. Not to mention I'll let you stay on here as my beneficiary. I'll give you a small sum to start an adventuring group. Your girlfriend can come and go as she pleases, and best of all, Evelinus is heavily invested in the Grand Library. He doesn't think I know, but he wants to become the first archdean of this new rival academy. Steve arched his brows at that last bit, and he rubbed his chin for a moment before pointing at the Archon. I'm just destroying the building, not the people. That's fine. I care about their artifacts and books. You're free to keep anything you steal. If you bring things here, I'll even store them for you. Steve thought it over a little longer. So let me make sure I got this straight. You're hiring me, as the third human mage ever, to go destroy a rival elven library to make sure that they don't become a threat to this academy. And the reason you want me to do it is so if I get caught, you can deny any involvement? She nodded. That is correct. Do we have a deal? Steve thought it over a little longer and reached out to shake her hand. Her gleaming blue body was warm to the touch, and it made his hair stand up a little when he shook her hand. We have a deal, but I'm going to be careful about this. I won't reveal my identity, and I'll make sure that this is done right. I'm not evil, you know. I just feel like mercenary work isn't a terrible thing, and I'll make sure my adventuring group reflects that. We'll just be a different brand of good. One less like those assholes in crap. We won't be hypocrites. We'll just do good in its basest, truest form. We will truly be paragons of virtue in our own way. But also not above this sort of thing. This was the job that secured Steve's life of adventure, his tales of spellslinging, and of course the formation of one of the most infamous adventuring groups of all time, Doom. But that's a story for another day.